It was a Tuesday morning when Robert Harrison decided to clean up his attic. His wife had died 15 years ago, and he never wanted to go through her things. His attic was filled with old furniture, photo albums, and other items he forgot about. Robert was 62, and today was the day he decided to retire for good after working as an architect for 35 years. He grabbed a dusty cardboard box that was tucked away in a corner and opened it. Robert found his wife's old hospital records and flipped through them one last time, trying to remember the day she passed away. He took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears, and grabbed another paper from the box. It was a birth certificate, and as he read the name on it, his heart almost stopped beating. Robert looked at the document in disbelief. It was his daughter, Emily, but according to the birth certificate, she was born healthy and weighing 10 pounds. Emily's birth mother was healthy and gave natural birth to the child, but the doctor said she died hours after birth because she was born weak. Robert frantically searched the box until he found his wife's journal from back then. He remembered her telling him about holding their beautiful baby girl and hearing her cries. Robert had never seen the journal's last pages because, ever since he learned about Emily, the grief had haunted him for the rest of his life. Robert sat on the attic floor and looked at the journal in his hands. If Emily was still alive, where was she? Who sent him the adoption papers 15 years ago? Robert's heart raced as he looked through the journal again and again, until he got a sudden realization. Someone was lying to him about Emily being dead. Robert ran to the hospital the following morning and asked to talk to someone in the records department. The receptionist gave him a cold look and told him to ask the nurse in charge for access to old patient records that were kept in the vault. Robert told him what he was looking for, but the lady said records from 15 years ago were sealed. He demanded to speak to the supervisor and was led to a small office at the end of the hallway. Robert was greeted by a middle-aged woman with tired eyes as she offered him a seat. Mrs. Davis, the woman's name was, gave him a concerned look when he told her about the adoption fraud. Robert gave her a copy of Emily's birth certificate and asked if anything like this had happened before. Mrs. Davis said there had been a case of a baby girl adoption fraud around the same time Emily was born, and the adoption agency they used was called Bright Future Adoptions. Robert left the hospital a few minutes later when Mrs. Davis told him she could do nothing about it. That night, Robert was still searching through the internet looking for any information about Bright Future Adoptions. He found the company's website and called the number listed on it. Robert introduced himself to the lady on the line and asked to speak to someone about the adoption of his daughter, Emily. Robert waited patiently as she said something to the other end of the line before asking him to hold for a moment. Robert sat in silence for what felt like hours. The lady on the line cleared her throat and said they had no record of any adoptions with Robert's name on file. Robert felt his heart sink at the sound of her voice. She was lying to him. Something inside Robert snapped for the first time in years. He was done with people taking his daughter from him. Robert knew what he had to do and picked up the phone to call the only person he knew he could trust. Detective Mark Collins was an old friend of Robert's who was well known in the city for his work as a private investigator, and Robert had always kept his business cards tucked away in his wallet. Detective Collins, a seasoned ex-cop, arrived at Robert's house the following evening and asked to see the documents regarding Emily's adoption fraud. Detective Collins said adoption forgeries were not common in his 30-plus years of service. When Robert handed him Emily's birth certificate and the journal he had been reading, when he first discovered the adoption fraud. 2 days later, Robert's friend told him that the adoption agency had been shut down 8 years ago for forging the signatures of adoptive parents. Mark also told Robert that several families had filed a complaint with him about losing their children to fraudulent adoption agencies. Robert was shocked when Mark told him the name of the woman who ran the adoption agency. Sarah Mitchell worked at a small counseling center across town. Robert wasted no time calling his former employee at the counseling center the day after learning of the adoption agency's fraud. Robert walked into Sarah Mitchell's office without an appointment and gave him a cold look. Sarah Mitchell gasped when Robert placed Emily's birth certificate on her desk and asked her where his daughter was. Robert told the woman he had proof that she stole his daughter and forged his signature on the adoption papers. Sarah Mitchell started crying before finally confessing to her crimes. She said Robert had been a single father raising Emily before his wife died of an illness 15 years ago. Robert had barely coped with her death, and with his wife gone and huge medical bills to pay, she assumed Robert wouldn't be able to care for his daughter. Sarah said she had lied to him to give Emily a better life and decided to sell her to a wealthy couple. The adoption agency forged Robert's signature on the papers and told him Emily had died hours after birth. Robert was furious when Sarah said Emily was still alive and 18 years old and living with the Thompson family. Sarah said her name was still Emily, and Robert's heart ached at the thought of his little girl living with strangers while he believed she was dead. Robert asked Sarah for the address to the Thompson family so he could finally meet his daughter, but she refused to give it to him. Sarah said it would be illegal to give the address to the family who stole her daughter, and Robert reminded Sarah that she was already committing a felony by stealing his daughter. Sarah finally agreed to write down the address for Robert after he reminded her that she would be doing the right thing. Robert stood outside the Thompson house the next morning and stared at the young woman walking toward him. She had long brown hair and looked just like Robert's wife. Robert gasped when recognition dawned on him, but the woman looked just like him. Robert watched from a distance as the young lady sat on the porch reading a book. Robert's chest tightened at the sight of the woman. He was finally reunited with his daughter, but she would know nothing about him. Robert wanted to run to her and tell her he was her father, but he knew it would not be the right time. Robert took a deep breath and slowly walked up to the young woman and knocked on the door. A woman named Linda Thompson answered the door. She had a frightened look on her face and immediately tried to close the door when Robert told her who he was. Robert asked Linda to give him 5 minutes of her time when she refused to let him in and said she was going to call the police. Robert pushed his hand against the door and told Linda that he was not there to hassle her. He was there to reunite with his daughter, Linda, and asked again if he could meet her. Linda told him he could not see her. She said she and her husband raised Emily for 15 years, and she was their daughter. Linda Thompson and her lawyers said Robert was trying to trick them into giving him his daughter because they were her legal guardians. Robert asked Linda to let him see his daughter one last time when the police arrived and told Linda she should not be harassing her. Robert met with a family law attorney named Rebecca Stone the following day to discuss his options regarding Linda's unwillingness to return Emily to his custody. Rebecca was a renowned adoption law specialist with decades of experience handling difficult adoption cases. Robert told Rebecca what had happened to him when she met with him in her office. Robert's journal, Emily's birth certificate, and Sarah's confession of forging his signature were all presented to Rebecca. She told Robert she could help him fight for legal guardianship of Emily and request a DNA test to prove Robert was Emily's biological father. Robert walked into the courthouse with his documents and journal the next morning. Linda Thompson and her lawyers were waiting for him when he arrived. Rebecca told the judge what had happened to Robert before presenting Linda with the evidence of forged signatures. The judge listened intently as Rebecca played the recording of Sarah's confession in the courtroom. Linda Thompson stood up and argued that she was Emily's real mother, claiming she and her husband had raised Emily for the past 15 years. Robert looked at her and felt something in him snap. Linda's words hurt because he knew she was telling the truth. Robert also knew she was being selfish by not letting him see his daughter. Sarah had stolen 15 years of Robert's life, and now Linda was keeping Emily from him because she was afraid of losing her. The judge asked Robert to say something when Linda finished her speech. Robert told the court about his wife's passing and the heartbreak he experienced when he was told Emily had died. The judge asked Emily to testify in court after Robert finished speaking. Emily stepped into the courtroom and looked around in confusion as the judge told her what was happening. Robert looked at her and wished he could take his daughter's pain away because she was being forced to testify in a court of law about something that happened 15 years ago. Robert whispered the name Emily to himself as he watched his daughter walk toward him. The judge asked Emily if she would consent to a DNA test to determine if Robert was her biological parent. Emily looked at Robert and then back at the judge, and finally gave her consent for the test when the judge asked her. Robert's heart pounded in his chest as the judge reminded the court that Emily's best interests would be considered when deciding whether to grant legal guardianship of Emily to Robert or Linda. Robert watched as Emily's eyes locked on his. It was then that Robert truly understood the magnitude of the situation and why Linda was so afraid of losing Emily. Robert went home that night and spent the evening sitting alone in his living room, staring blankly at the wall. Robert told himself he would wait to hear the results of the DNA test. He prayed that the test would confirm what he already knew in his heart to be true. Robert wanted his daughter to know that he never gave her up and that he had tried to find her for 15 long years. All he had to do now was wait for the results of the test that would finally prove he was her father. 3 weeks later, Robert sat in the living room of his home, staring at the envelope in his hands. Robert's heart raced as he read the words on the paper. His tears fell silently to the floor as the reality of the situation finally sank in. Robert Harrison was Emily's biological father, and he would do whatever it took to be reunited with his daughter. The judge called for the next hearing, and Robert walked into the courthouse with a determined look on his face. Robert looked at the empty chairs next to Linda Thompson and saw that she was not there. Robert sat down in one of the empty seats when he arrived at the courtroom and noticed that Sarah Mitchell was also missing. Robert's heart sank as he wondered what had happened to his wife's best friend and assistant. The judge told the court that the DNA test results had proven Sarah Mitchell's lies about Emily being born healthy and strong. The adoption records were fake, and Linda Thompson and her lawyers were ordered to appear in court to explain why they continued to keep Emily from her biological father. Robert listened to the judge's ruling and felt a wave of relief wash over him. The adoption of his daughter had been invalid because Sarah had forged his signature on the papers, and Linda's lawyers could do nothing to stop him from gaining legal guardianship of Emily. The judge reminded the court that Emily was now 18 years old, and that she had the right to decide for herself where she wanted to live and who she wanted to be considered family. The crowd in the courtroom gasped as the judge turned to Emily and asked her what she wanted. Robert's heart pounded in his chest as he watched his daughter stand up and walk toward him. Emily looked at Robert and then at Linda, who was sitting in one of the few remaining seats in the courtroom. Robert stood up and turned to face Linda when Emily stopped about 5 feet in front of him. Emily looked up at Robert and told him, "I always felt like something was missing in my life. Now I know it was you." Emily extended her hand toward Robert, and he smiled at his daughter before embracing her in a warm hug. The courtroom erupted in applause as Linda Thompson silently sobbed in her seat. Sarah Mitchell was also sentenced to prison for forging Robert's signature on the adoption papers. But the judge reminded everyone in the courtroom that Sarah would spend the rest of her life behind bars. In the weeks that followed, Robert and Emily slowly began to rebuild their relationship. Robert took Emily to coffee every weekend and showed her the journals he kept after her passing. Robert shared stories about his wife, and Emily listened to him recount every detail of her life before she moved to Linda's house. Emily eventually understood what had happened to her, and that her biological father loved her dearly and wanted her to be a part of his life. Robert encouraged Emily to remain close to Linda and remind her that love had no boundaries. Robert watched as Emily's eyes sparkled with excitement as she told him about the beautiful world around her. Robert smiled when she said she would always be grateful for him finding her, but he knew the most important thing was that he had done the right thing by fighting to be a part of her life. One evening, Robert and Emily walked hand in hand across his front porch as they enjoyed the sunset. Emily turned to Robert and said, "You made the right choice by fighting to be a part of my life." Robert looked at his daughter with a smile on his face and placed his hand over hers. "Yes, I did," he said, "and I never stopped loving you even for one day." Robert knew that the battle had been worth it because he had fought for what was right, and he would never regret finding Emily after all these years.